The hidden lesson behind Ruth and Boaz isn't really about romance. It's about what happens when you've lost so much that you stop expecting God to do anything good for you anymore. Ruth had no future, no security, no guarantees. She was waking up every day carrying grief, rejection, and uncertainty, trying to stay faithful while her life made absolutely no sense. And maybe that's where you are right now. You're still praying, still showing up, still trusting God on the outside. But deep down, you're wondering why obedience feels so heavy when heaven feels so silent. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't the waiting. It's not knowing if God is still writing something good in the middle of your loss. And what if the real story of Ruth and Boaz has nothing to do with love and everything to do with what God is doing when you think your life has been forgotten? You know what it feels like to keep showing up while your heart quietly grows tired. You pray, but nothing seems to move. You ask God for clarity, yet your mind stays crowded with questions that never fully settle. Some mornings begin with anxiety before your feet even touch the floor. Other nights end with thoughts you cannot silence. You try to trust God, but deep inside, there is a battle you rarely speak out loud. A battle between what you believe and what you feel. Because faith tells you God is present, but your emotions asks why everything still feels so uncertain. You read verses about peace, yet your mind keeps replaying fears about the future. You'll hear people talk about breakthrough, favor, and answered prayer, but your own season feels painfully ordinary, quiet, delayed, unclear. And after a while, silence begins to feel personal. You start wondering things you never thought you would wonder. Did God forget me? Did I miss his plan somehow? Why does it seem like everyone else is moving forward while I remain stuck in the same emotional place? Why does heaven feel so quiet when my heart is carrying so much? What makes this struggle even heavier is that outwardly, life may still appear normal. You continue functioning, you continue working, you continue helping people, you continue smiling in conversations. But internally, something feels unsettled. There is a weariness that words cannot fully explain. And maybe that is why the story of Ruth matters more than most people realize. Because Ruth was not simply living through a romantic story. She was living through loss, uncertainty, displacement, and invisible emotional pain. Before redemption ever appeared, there was grief. Before restoration came emptiness. Before Boaz entered the picture, Ruth was simply trying to survive another difficult day without knowing what God was doing behind the scenes. That is the hidden lesson most people miss. When people think about Ruth and Boaz, they often focus only on the ending. They see the redemption, the restoration, the beautiful outcome. But they forget how much silence existed before any of that became visible. And maybe that is where you are right now. Not at the ending, not at the breakthrough, not at the part where everything suddenly makes sense. Maybe you are in the middle of the uncertainty where nothing feels clear yet. That space can feel emotionally exhausting because human nature wants visible answers. You want to know where life is going? You want certainty that your prayers matter. You want reassurance that your waiting is not meaningless. But God often works differently than we expect. One of the hardest truths to accept is that God rarely explains everything immediately. He often unfolds purpose slowly, quietly, through ordinary moments that seem insignificant at first. And that can frustrate you when your heart is desperate for immediate clarity, because sometimes you think if God were truly working, you would feel stronger by now. You would feel more confident, more secure, more certain. But the book of Ruth reveals something deeply important about the nature of God. God can be fully present even when he appears silent. That changes everything, because silence is not always absence, and waiting is not always punishment. Yet when you are emotionally tired, it becomes difficult to separate truth from feeling. Your thoughts begin interpreting delay as rejection. Fear starts speaking louder than faith, and eventually, you can begin measuring God's presence by your emotions instead of his character. That is why seasons of uncertainty become spiritual battles inside the mind. You may still believe in God while secretly struggling to trust him fully. You may still pray while wondering if anyone is listening. You may still worship while carrying disappointment underneath the surface. And perhaps the hardest part is that you cannot always explain this tension to other people because the struggle is internal. It is waking up exhausted from It is trying to remain hopeful while fighting invisible discouragement. It is asking God for direction while feeling emotionally lost. It is wanting peace while your thoughts continue racing toward worst-case scenarios. You start feeling emotionally displaced, almost like Ruth entering a land that did not feel familiar. You may still recognize your life externally, but internally, something feels disconnected. The peace you once carried feels distant. The confidence you once had feels weakened. The sense of purpose you once felt now feels clouded by uncertainty. And when life enters these hidden seasons, many people assume God has stepped away. But what if the opposite is true? What if God does some of his deepest work in seasons that appear the quietest? That idea challenges the way most people think about faith, because many expect God to move through dramatic moments, loud miracles, instant breakthroughs, immediate answers. But the story of Ruth unfolds differently. God is rarely mentioned through visible miracles in the story. There are no seas splitting, no fire falling from heaven, no dramatic supernatural event. Instead, God moves quietly through conversations, decisions, ordinary routines, unexpected kindness, and unseen timing. At first glance, it almost looks ordinary, but underneath the ordinary, God is positioning lives for redemption. And maybe your life feels ordinary right now too. Maybe you are waiting for a sign while God is already working through small details you keep overlooking. Maybe you are searching for dramatic clarity while God is building quiet strength inside you. Maybe you think nothing is changing because the transformation is happening deeper than your emotions can currently recognize. That is one of the most difficult parts of spiritual growth. Sometimes God works beneath the surface before anything changes externally. And during that process, your faith gets tested in uncomfortable ways. Can you trust God before you see results? Can you continue walking faithfully without complete understanding? Can you believe purpose still exists, even when your circumstances feel confusing? Those questions become deeply personal during seasons of waiting, because waiting exposes what your heart truly leans on. It reveals how quickly fear can take control when certainty disappears. It reveals how dependent you may have become on visible reassurance. It reveals how difficult it is to trust what you cannot yet see. But hidden inside Ruth's story is an invitation to see your own season differently. Not as abandoned, not as forgotten, not as meaningless, but as a chapter where God may be preparing something your present emotions cannot fully understand yet. Ruth could not see the ending when she entered the fields to gather grain. Naomi could not see restoration while grieving her losses. Nothing looked significant in the moment, yet every ordinary step was quietly leading somewhere greater. And that is where the tension begins to shift. Because what if your current season is not evidence that God stopped working? What if the silence itself is part of the process? What if purpose is unfolding right now in ways hidden from your immediate understanding? Those questions matter because fear always rushes to create conclusions before God finishes the story. Fear says, nothing will change. You are too late. Your best days are behind you. God has forgotten you. But the deeper truth inside Ruth's story reveals something else entirely. God often works most powerfully in hidden places. Not when everything feels obvious, not when every answer is visible, but when faith learns to keep walking through uncertainty. And that sounds beautiful in theory until you actually live through it, because trusting God during confusion requires a different kind of faith than trusting Him during clarity. Anyone can feel confident when the outcome is visible, but hidden faith is formed when you keep moving forward without knowing how everything will unfold. That is where many people are struggling right now. Not because they stopped believing in God completely, but because they are exhausted from carrying unanswered questions. And maybe you understand that exhaustion personally. Maybe you are tired of pretending everything feels okay, tired of trying to stay hopeful, tired of wondering when life will finally feel stable again. But before this journey moves toward restoration, there is something you must first understand. Loss does not always mean God has left. In fact, Some of the deepest beginnings in Scripture first appear disguised as endings. One of the most dangerous assumptions you can make during a painful season is believing that loss automatically means God has abandoned you. That assumption quietly reshapes the way you see everything. It changes the way you pray. It changes the way you think. It changes the way you interpret your future. And if you are not careful, pain can slowly convince you that your story is already over, while God is still writing chapters you cannot yet see. That is exactly what makes the beginning of Ruth's story so powerful. The story does not begin with celebration. It begins with emptiness. Naomi loses her husband. Then she loses her sons. The stability she once knew disappears. The future she expected collapses. What once felt secure suddenly becomes uncertain, and Ruth walks directly into that same pain. She becomes a widow in a foreign place, carrying grief while stepping into a future she cannot fully understand. There is no clear roadmap, no visible guarantee that things will improve, only uncertainty. That matters because many people imagine biblical faith as constant confidence and emotional strength. But Scripture repeatedly shows people walking through confusion, sorrow, and unanswered questions. The difference is not that they never struggled emotionally. The difference is that God was still working, even inside the struggle. That truth becomes difficult to believe when your own life feels heavy, because loss has a way of narrowing your vision. When disappointment accumulates long enough, your mind begins interpreting the future through pain instead of truth. You stop expecting good things. You stop believing restoration is possible. You become emotionally defensive because hope itself feels risky. Maybe you know that feeling. You want to trust God, but disappointment has made your heart cautious. You pray carefully because you are tired of feeling let down. You avoid expecting too much because fear whispers that hope only creates more pain. That is what prolonged discouragement does to the human heart. It slowly teaches you to survive instead of believe. And yet, the hidden lesson in Ruth's story is that God often begins restoration in places that initially look empty. That is difficult for the human mind to accept because most people assume purpose always arrives wrapped in clarity. But sometimes God starts rebuilding your life while everything still appears broken externally. Naomi could not yet see restoration. Ruth could not yet see redemption. All they could see was loss, but heaven already saw a future they could not imagine yet. That perspective changes the meaning of difficult seasons completely, because sometimes what feels like the end is actually the painful beginning of repositioning, not punishment, not abandonment. Repositioning. There are moments in life where God allows familiar things to fall apart because your future cannot unfold while you remain attached to what was never meant to carry you forever. That does not mean the pain is small. It does not mean grief is easy. And it certainly does not mean you should pretend everything feels okay. The book of Ruth never ignores human sorrow. Naomi openly expresses bitterness. She openly admits her pain. She feels emptied by life. And maybe that honesty is important for you to hear, because some people believe faith means suppressing emotion. They think trusting God means never admitting fear, sadness, exhaustion, or disappointment. But biblical faith is not pretending. Pain does not exist. Real faith acknowledges pain while refusing to let pain become the final authority. That distinction matters deeply because your emotions are real, but they are not always reliable interpreters of what God is doing. There are seasons where your feelings will tell you nothing good is ahead, nothing meaningful is happening. You are forgotten, you are stuck forever, but feelings can only see the present moment. God sees the entire process, and one of the hardest spiritual lessons is learning that God's activity is not limited to what you currently understand emotionally. Sometimes He is working underneath realities your mind cannot yet perceive. That is exactly what happened in Ruth's story. At first, everything appeared small and insignificant. Two grieving women returning quietly to Bethlehem. No dramatic miracle, no visible breakthrough, no immediate solution, just grief, questions, and uncertainty about what comes next. But hidden inside those ordinary moments was divine movement already unfolding. This is where many people miss what God is doing in their own lives. They dismiss small beginnings because they expect a dramatic intervention. They overlook ordinary opportunities because they expected instant transformation. They assume silence means inactivity. But Scripture repeatedly reveals a God who works patiently through processes. And processes can feel frustrating when your heart wants immediate relief, especially when your emotions are exhausted. Emotional exhaustion changes how you experience time. A few months can feel endless. A season of uncertainty can begin feeling permanent. Waiting can feel heavier because your mind constantly searches for evidence that things are changing. But what if transformation is happening in ways you cannot measure yet? What if God is strengthening parts of your character that comfort never could? What if hidden seasons are shaping deeper trust inside you? What if this chapter is preparing you emotionally and spiritually for something your current perspective cannot fully understand? Those questions matter because God's preparation often feels invisible while it is happening, and invisibility creates tension. You keep asking, if God is working, why can't I see it? Why does progress feel so slow? Why does everything still feel uncertain? The story of Ruth gently answers those questions by showing that God's guidance often unfolds through ordinary obedience rather than instant clarity. Ruth did not receive a complete explanation for her future. She simply kept moving forward faithfully, one step at a time. And honestly, that can feel uncomfortable because most people want certainty before movement. They want guaranteed outcomes before trust. They want visible reassurance before surrender. But faith often develops in reverse. Sometimes movement comes before understanding. Trust grows before answers appear. And peace develops slowly while you continue walking without full clarity. That process exposes the deeper battle happening inside the human heart. The battle between control and trust. You want to know where life is going? You want assurance that your prayers are leading somewhere meaningful. You want confirmation that your waiting is not wasted. Yet Ruth's story reveals that God rarely unfolds the entire picture immediately. Instead, He invites people to trust Him through partial understanding. And that invitation can feel deeply uncomfortable when fear already occupies your thoughts. Because fear constantly demands visible proof. Fear says, if you cannot see the outcome, assume the worst. If things feel uncertain, prepare for disappointment. If prayers seem delayed, maybe nothing is happening. But God's pattern throughout Scripture looks different. Again and again, He works quietly before people recognize what He is building. Joseph could not see purpose inside betrayal. David could not see kingship while hiding in caves. And Ruth could not see redemption while gathering leftover grain in a field. Yet God was present in every hidden step. That truth becomes deeply personal when you begin applying it to your own life. Because maybe you are interpreting your current season only through what feels visible right now. Maybe you are defining your future based on temporary emotions. Maybe you are assuming silence means absence because nothing dramatic has changed yet. But what if your understanding is incomplete? What if God is already arranging details you cannot currently recognize? What if provision is forming quietly beneath the surface? What if this painful season is not destroying your purpose, but preparing it? Those possibilities challenge the hopelessness fear tries to create. And slowly, something begins shifting internally. Not because every answer suddenly appears, not because life instantly becomes easy, but because you begin realizing that God's faithfulness does not depend on your ability to see the full picture immediately. That realization changes how you carry uncertainty. Instead of viewing your waiting season as meaningless, you begin asking a different question. What if God is still working here too? And that question opens the door to one of the most important lessons hidden inside Ruth's story. Faith is often built through small acts of obedience, long before visible breakthrough ever arrives. There is something deeply humbling about the way Ruth continued moving forward. Not because her circumstances suddenly improved, not because she finally understood what God was doing, not because all her fears disappeared, but because she kept showing up anyway. That detail matters more than most people realize. Because many people assume faith is proven through dramatic spiritual moments. They think strong faith always looks confident, fearless, and emotionally certain. But the story of Ruth reveals a quieter kind of faithfulness, a faith that keeps taking small steps, even while carrying unanswered questions. And honestly, that kind of faith is often harder. It is easier to trust God during emotional highs. It is easier to feel hopeful when visible progress exists. But quiet obedience during uncertainty requires something deeper. It requires trust without immediate reward. Ruth entered the field simply to gather leftover grain. At first glance, it looks ordinary, small, almost insignificant. Yet hidden inside those repetitive daily actions was a spiritual lesson many people desperately need to understand today. God often works through consistency before breakthrough. That can feel disappointing when your heart wants immediate change. Because when you are emotionally exhausted, ordinary life can begin feeling meaningless. The routines feel repetitive. The prayers feel unanswered. The days begin blending together. And eventually, you start wondering whether your small efforts even matter anymore. You continue trying, continue praying, continue hoping, continue showing up. But internally, there are moments when you quietly ask, what is the point? Is anything actually changing? Does God even notice these small acts of faithfulness? Ruth's story answers those questions in a powerful way. Yes, he notices. Every ordinary step mattered. Every small act of obedience mattered. Every quiet moment of perseverance mattered, even before Ruth understood the larger purpose unfolding around her. That is important because modern culture often celebrates dramatic transformation while overlooking slow spiritual growth. People want instant healing, instant clarity, instant confidence, instant peace. But God frequently develops maturity gradually, and gradual growth can feel frustrating because it rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. Most of the time, spiritual growth feels ordinary. It looks like choosing not to give up when discouragement whispers constantly. It looks like continuing to pray even when emotions feel numb. It looks like resisting fear one thought at a time. It looks like getting through another difficult day while quietly trusting God still sees you. Those moments may not appear impressive externally, but heaven sees them differently because hidden faithfulness shapes the heart. And perhaps that is one reason waiting seasons become spiritually significant. They expose whether your faith depends only on visible results or whether trust can survive uncertainty too. That tension becomes deeply personal when life feels repetitive and emotionally draining. You begin comparing your progress to other people. You wonder why others seem to experience breakthrough while your own season remains quiet. You start questioning whether your hidden efforts carry any value at all. But one of the enemy's most effective lies is convincing people that small obedience is insignificant. Because if you begin believing your daily faithfulness does not matter, discouragement grows stronger. Eventually, you stop expecting God to work through ordinary moments entirely. Yet the book of Ruth reveals the opposite. The field mattered. The small steps mattered. The consistency mattered. Not because the actions themselves were glamorous, but because God was weaving purpose through them quietly. And maybe that is exactly what is happening in your life right now. Maybe the conversations you thought were small are not small. Maybe the quiet prayers still matter more than you realize. Maybe your daily perseverance carries spiritual weight even when your emotions feel tired. One of the hidden dangers of emotional exhaustion is that it blinds you to gradual transformation. You only notice what has not changed yet. You focus on what still feels unresolved. You measure your life through visible outcomes instead of internal growth. But internal growth is often where God starts first. Before circumstances shift externally, He begins strengthening endurance internally. Before clarity arrives, He develops trust. Before breakthrough becomes visible, He teaches dependence. That process is rarely comfortable because dependence forces you to confront how much control you truly want. Most people want faith that still allows them to predict outcomes. They want trust without vulnerability. They want surrender without uncertainty. But Ruth's story reveals that real faith often develops when certainty disappears. Ruth did not know where provision would come from long term. She did not know how restoration would unfold. She simply responded faithfully to the step in front of her. And there is something incredibly powerful about that, because many people become paralyzed waiting for complete clarity before taking any step at all. They think, once I feel confident, then I will move forward. Once fear disappears, then I will trust God fully. Once I understand everything, then I will obey. But clarity often comes after movement, not before it. That is one of the great tensions of faith. God frequently reveals direction progressively rather than instantly, and progressive guidance requires patience. Patience is difficult because fear constantly demands immediate resolution. Fear hates uncertainty. It searches endlessly for guarantees. It wants every detail explained before peace becomes possible. But if peace only exists once every answer arrives, then peace becomes impossible during most seasons of life. That is why God teaches trust differently. He teaches it through daily dependence, not tomorrow's answers. Today's obedience, not complete explanations. Enough grace for the next step. Ruth embodied that kind of quiet dependence. She woke up each day and continued gathering grain without fully understanding how God was arranging her future behind the scenes. And perhaps that is where your own struggle feels most real right now. Because maybe you are tired of taking small steps, tired of waiting, tired of hoping, tired of carrying responsibilities while your heart still feels uncertain. There are moments when even basic faithfulness feels emotionally exhausting. Moments when praying feels difficult. Moments when motivation disappears. Moments when your mind becomes so overwhelmed that peace feels distant. But hidden inside those ordinary struggles is a truth that can slowly change how you see your season. God is not only present in the breakthrough, He is present in the process. That means your hidden days matter too. The days where nobody sees your internal battle. The days where you quietly choose faith over despair. The days where you resist, giving up, even while emotions feel heavy. Those moments shape something deeper inside you, because spiritual maturity is not formed only through victory. It is formed through perseverance, and perseverance changes you slowly. It teaches you that God's faithfulness is not dependent on emotional highs. It teaches you that peace can coexist with unanswered questions. It teaches you that purpose may still exist, even when your circumstances feel painfully ordinary. That realization begins shifting your perspective. Instead of constantly asking, "Why is nothing happening?" you begin asking, "What is God building inside me through this season?" That question opens the door to deeper understanding, because maybe your waiting season is not empty after all. Maybe God is strengthening qualities that quick answers never could. Maybe the hidden process itself is preparing you for responsibilities, relationships, and purposes you are not ready to carry yet. Ruth could not see the larger picture while standing in the fields, but every ordinary moment was positioning her for something greater than she imagined. And that reveals another difficult truth many people resist. God's timing rarely matches human urgency, because while you are asking for immediate answers, God may be preparing long-term transformation. While you are asking for escape from discomfort, God may be developing stability inside you first. While you are focused on the delay, God may be focused on who you are becoming through it. That does not make waiting easy, but it gives waiting meaning, and meaning changes how suffering is carried. Because suffering without purpose feels unbearable, but suffering connected to growth creates still. One question remains difficult for the human heart to accept. If God truly cares, why does He allow the process to take so long sometimes? That question leads directly into one of the deepest hidden lessons behind Ruth and Boaz. Not every delay is rejection. Sometimes delay is preparation. Waiting changes people, not just externally through circumstances, but internally through the pressure it places on the heart and mind. A long season of uncertainty can quietly reshape the way you think about God, yourself, and your future. At first, waiting usually feels manageable. You tell yourself to stay patient. You believe answers will come soon. You continue trusting with expectation, but when days become months, and months become longer seasons, something deeper begins happening emotionally. Fear starts asking difficult questions. What if nothing changes? What if this season never ends? What if God is silent because I disappointed him somehow? What if I keep hoping and still end up heartbroken? Those questions become heavier because waiting often feels deeply personal, especially when you see other people moving forward while your own life seems paused. You watch others experience opportunities, healing, relationships, direction, or clarity, while you remain in uncertainty. And if you are not careful, comparison slowly poisons trust. You begin interpreting delay as rejection. But the story of Ruth and Boaz reveals something profoundly different about God's timing. Delay is not always denial, and silence is not proof of abandonment. Sometimes God moves slowly because he is aligning things you cannot yet see. That hidden alignment is one of the central lessons inside Ruth's story. Nothing unfolds randomly. Every step develops gradually. Ruth does not meet Boaz immediately in a dramatic moment. There is no sudden miracle that instantly removes every hardship. Instead, the story unfolds through timing, process, patience, and quiet providence. And honestly, that can feel frustrating to the human heart, because human nature prefers immediate relief over gradual transformation. You want clarity now. You want peace now. You want answers now? You want confirmation that your life is moving somewhere meaningful. But God often prioritizes depth over speed. That is difficult because your emotions usually interpret slow movement as inactivity. Yet some of the most important work God does happens invisibly beneath the surface before anything becomes visible externally. Think about how much internal preparation must happen before lasting change can be carried wisely. Without preparation, blessings can become burdens. Without maturity, opportunities can destroy instead of strengthen. Without deeper trust, people often build their lives on unstable foundations. So while you are focused on what has not arrived yet, God may be focused on preparing your heart to sustain what is coming. Ruth's story reflects this beautifully. Ruth was not simply waiting for provision. She was being shaped through the process itself. Her character was revealed through consistency. Her humility was revealed through quiet obedience. Her trust was revealed through uncertainty. And those qualities mattered, because God's timing is not careless. It is purposeful. That truth becomes extremely important during seasons where life feels delayed. Because when answers take longer than expected, your mind naturally searches for explanations. Sometimes you'll blame yourself. Other times, you assume God is withholding good things from you. And eventually, discouragement can convince you that waiting itself is evidence something is wrong. But not every waiting season is punishment. Sometimes waiting is protection. Sometimes waiting is preparation. Sometimes waiting is alignment. And sometimes God delays visible answers because there are details unfolding beyond your current understanding. That requires humility to accept, because part of the human struggle is wanting control over timing. You want to know when things will change. You want guarantees about the future. You want certainty that your waiting will eventually make sense. But God rarely provides complete timelines. Instead, he asks for trust one season at a time. That kind of trust feels uncomfortable because uncertainty exposes how dependent people are on visible reassurance. Most people feel secure only when outcomes appear predictable. But biblical faith develops differently. It grows strongest when certainty disappears. That is why waiting seasons often become defining spiritual moments. They expose whether your trust depends only on what you can currently see. And that exposure can feel painful because waiting reveals hidden fears. It reveals how quickly anxiety tries to control your thoughts. It reveals how deeply you crave stability. It reveals how difficult it is to surrender outcomes you cannot control. Maybe that describes your current season more than you admit openly. Maybe outwardly you appear calm, but internally your mind feels exhausted from trying to predict the future. Maybe you constantly replay scenarios, searching for reassurance. Maybe your thoughts race ahead, trying to solve problems God never asked you to carry alone. One of the exhausting realities of anxiety is that it constantly tries to force clarity prematurely. It tells you, figure everything out now. Control every possibility. Prepare for every disappointment. But anxiety cannot create peace. It only creates mental exhaustion. And eventually, your soul becomes tired from carrying burdens that were never meant to be managed through fear. That is why Ruth's story feels so refreshing spiritually. Ruth was not controlling outcomes. She was walking faithfully through the process. There's a major difference between those two things. Faithfulness focuses on obedience. Fear obsesses over outcomes. Faithfulness asks, what is the next right step? Fear asks, what if everything goes wrong? Faithfulness trusts God with timing. Fear demands immediate certainty. And perhaps one reason God allows waiting seasons is because they slowly teach the heart to release control. Not all at once, gradually, because surrender is rarely instant. Most people surrender in layers. At first, they trust God verbally while still trying to control everything internally. But eventually, prolonged uncertainty exposes the limits of human control. You realize no amount of overthinking can force peace into existence. No amount of anxiety can accelerate God's timing. And that realization becomes a turning point. Because eventually you must choose. Will fear continue interpreting your future? Or will trust slowly become stronger than uncertainty? That choice does not happen once. It happens repeatedly. Every anxious thought becomes an invitation either toward fear or trust. Every delayed answer becomes an opportunity either for discouragement or deeper dependence. And little by little, waiting begins transforming you internally. Not because waiting itself is enjoyable, but because dependence on God deepens when other forms of security feel unstable. That is one reason some of the strongest believers are often people who endured long seasons of uncertainty. They learned that God's faithfulness was not dependent on immediate results. They discovered something deeper. God can still be trustworthy even before outcomes make sense. Ruth learned that gradually. She could not yet see the full future. She did not know how redemption would unfold. But step by step, God's timing revealed itself with precision. She could never have orchestrated herself. And maybe your own life contains hidden timing you do not recognize yet. Maybe some closed doors protected you. Maybe some delays preserved you from things you were not prepared to carry. Maybe some unanswered prayers are connected to a bigger picture your current perspective cannot fully see. That possibility changes the emotional meaning of waiting. Instead of seeing delay only as frustration, you begin considering that God may still be guiding the process carefully, not ignoring you, not forgetting you, guiding you. And slowly, urgency begins loosening its grip on your heart. Not because every answer suddenly appears, but because you begin realizing peace does not require immediate clarity. Peace grows when trust becomes stronger than fear. Still, another question naturally rises during difficult seasons. If God is truly working behind the scenes, how does He actually move in everyday life when no miracle seems obvious? That question reveals another hidden lesson inside the story of Ruth and Boaz. God often works through ordinary people, quiet kindness, and unseen moments of providence far more than most people notice. One of the reasons people miss God's activity in their lives is because they expect Him to move only through dramatic moments. They wait for a miracle so obvious that no explanation could compete with it. They expect instant clarity, a sudden breakthrough, a powerful emotional experience that removes every doubt immediately. But the story of Ruth and Boaz reveals something quieter and far more personal. God often works through ordinary people. Simple kindness, open doors, daily provision, and moments that initially appear completely normal. That truth changes how you begin seeing your life. Because if you only look for God in dramatic moments, you may completely overlook the ways He is already sustaining you right now. Ruth's encounter with Boaz did not begin with fireworks or visible supernatural signs. It began in a field during an ordinary day of work. At first glance, it almost feels random, yet underneath the ordinary details, divine alignment was quietly unfolding. That matters deeply because many people secretly believe God's silence means He is inactive. But Ruth's story reveals a God who moves carefully through timing, relationships, character, and hidden providence. And providence often looks ordinary while it is happening. That can feel difficult to recognize during emotionally exhausting seasons because pain narrows your attention toward what is missing. You become so focused on unanswered prayers that you stop noticing smaller forms of grace already surrounding you. You overlook the conversation that strengthened you unexpectedly, the opportunity that appeared at the right moment, the person who encouraged you when your heart was discouraged, the strength that carried you through a day you thought would break you, the provision that arrived quietly when you needed it most. None of those things may appear dramatic externally, but they matter. Because God's faithfulness is often woven into ordinary life more deeply than people realize. Boaz's kindness toward Ruth reflected something larger than human generosity alone. Through his integrity and compassion, God was quietly creating restoration long before Ruth fully understood what was happening. That reveals an important spiritual truth. God's answers do not always arrive through visible miracles. Sometimes they arrive through people, through timing, through opportunities, through unexpected favor, through unseen alignment. And perhaps that is why spiritual awareness matters so much. Because when your heart becomes consumed by fear, you lose the ability to recognize quiet grace. Fear constantly focuses on absence. Faith slowly learns to notice presence. Fear says, nothing is happening, nothing is changing, you are alone in this. But faith begins noticing the smaller evidences of God's care that anxiety often ignores, the strength to keep going, the wisdom gained through hardship, the doors that opened unexpectedly, the relationships that brought support at the right time. Those moments may seem small individually, but together they reveal something powerful. God has not abandoned you, and maybe you need that reminder more than you realize. Because when life feels uncertain, loneliness can become emotionally overwhelming. Not necessarily physical loneliness, but spiritual loneliness. The feeling that nobody fully understands the internal weight you carry. You continue functioning outwardly while inwardly feeling disconnected, overwhelmed, or emotionally drained. And during those moments, you may start believing you must carry everything alone. But Ruth's story quietly challenges that belief too. God often brings provision through community and connection. That does not mean every relationship is healthy or every person understands your journey completely. But it does mean God frequently uses people as part of his restoration process. Boaz became part of Ruth's provision. Naomi became part of Ruth's support. And Ruth herself became part of Naomi's restoration. None of them could see the full picture individually, yet God was weaving their lives together intentionally. That hidden weaving still happens today. And perhaps some of the people currently present in your life are not accidental either. Maybe certain conversations are shaping you more than you realize. Maybe some relationships are carrying divine purpose beneath ordinary interaction. Maybe God is already surrounding you with support, while fear keeps convincing you that you are completely alone. That possibility changes how you view everyday life, because suddenly, ordinary moments carry spiritual meaning. The problem is that many people overlook this because they assume God only works through dramatic supernatural intervention. But Scripture repeatedly reveals a God who moves through daily realities just as powerfully. Joseph's imprisonment eventually positioned him for purpose. David's hidden years prepared him quietly. Esther's placement within the palace unfolded strategically. And Ruth's ordinary routine in the fields became part of a greater redemption story. None of those processes looked impressive in the beginning. That is important because sometimes you are judging your current season too early. You assume nothing meaningful is happening because the process feels ordinary. You assume God is distant because life still feels unresolved. You assume your story lacks purpose because the breakthrough has not arrived dramatically. But what if meaning is already unfolding underneath the surface? What if the ordinary details matter more than you realize? One of the hidden dangers of anxiety is that it constantly demands extraordinary reassurance before peace becomes possible. It tells you that unless something dramatic changes immediately, you should remain fearful. But God often trains trust differently. He teaches the heart to recognize His presence in ordinary provision first. Daily bread, daily strength, daily guidance, daily grace, not always overwhelming signs, often quiet faithfulness. That is difficult because human emotions crave certainty. They want undeniable proof that the future will turn out well. Yet faith matures by learning to trust God's character even when complete certainty does not exist. And that maturity changes how you experience life. Instead of constantly searching for dramatic evidence, you begin noticing subtle evidence of God's care. Instead of assuming silence means abandonment, you begin realizing God may already be moving quietly around you. Instead of believing your life is directionless, you begin seeing that hidden alignment may still be unfolding. That shift is deeply important because hopelessness grows strongest when people stop recognizing God's activity entirely. Once hopelessness settles deeply into the heart, everything begins looking meaningless. Prayer feels empty. Waiting feels pointless. Daily life feels emotionally heavy. But Ruth's story gently interrupts hopelessness by showing that redemption can begin quietly long before it becomes visible fully. And perhaps that is where your own life currently exists. Maybe you are standing inside ordinary moments without realizing how much God is already arranging behind the scenes. Maybe the very season you call slow is actually full of hidden preparation. Maybe some of the answers you seek are already developing gradually through people, opportunities, and unseen timing. You may not fully recognize it yet. Ruth did not either. That is what makes this story so deeply comforting. God was active before Ruth understood the outcome. God was guiding details before Naomi regained hope. God was preparing redemption while everything still appeared uncertain externally. And He still works that way now. The challenge is that human emotions often resist quiet processes. You want immediate closure, immediate understanding, immediate certainty. But some of God's deepest work unfolds slowly enough that only faith recognizes it while it is happening. That realization changes how you carry your present season. Instead of constantly asking, "Why is God silent?" you begin asking, "Where might God already be moving that I have not noticed yet?" That question opens your heart differently, because once you realize God's activity is not always loud, you begin seeing life with greater spiritual awareness. You stop measuring His presence only through dramatic emotion and start recognizing His faithfulness woven throughout ordinary days. And eventually, one deeper realization begins changing everything internally. God's silence never meant He stopped being present. There comes a moment in long seasons of waiting where the real battle is no longer only about the situation itself. It becomes a battle over interpretation. How will you interpret the silence? How will you interpret the delay? How will you interpret the uncertainty that still remains? Because eventually, your mind will choose a narrative. Fear creates one narrative. Faith creates another. Fear says God is absent because nothing feels clear. Faith slowly learns that God can be deeply present even when life still feels unresolved. That realization changes everything internally, but it rarely happens instantly. Most people arrive there gradually after wrestling through disappointment, confusion, and emotional exhaustion. And maybe that is exactly where you are now. Tired of trying to understand everything, tired of carrying invisible pressure, tired of waiting for certainty that never fully comes. And yet, hidden inside Ruth's story is one of the most comforting truths in all of Scripture. God's silence never meant He stopped working. Not once. While Ruth gathered grain, God was working. While Naomi grieved, God was working. While the future remained unclear, God was working. The absence of visible answers did not equal the absence of divine activity. That truth matters deeply because emotions often confuse visibility with reality. If you cannot see movement, you assume nothing is happening. If answers delay, you assume prayers are being ignored. If clarity disappears, you assume God stepped away. But some of God's greatest work happens invisibly before it becomes visible. Think about how roots grow underground long before fruit appears above the surface. The hidden process matters just as much as the visible outcome. Yet because human beings naturally focus on what can be seen immediately, they often underestimate hidden growth entirely. The same thing happens spiritually. You may not feel stronger yet. You may not see complete transformation yet. You may still carry questions that remain unanswered, but hidden growth can still be happening inside you. And often, that hidden growth is preparing you for a future your present version could not sustain yet. That requires trust to accept because your emotions still crave immediate reassurance. part of me still wants God to explain everything clearly. You want certainty that the future will make sense eventually. But God rarely removes every unknown immediately. Instead, He teaches trust within the unknown. That is where mature faith begins developing. Not when every answer appears, but when trust survives without complete answers. Ruth never received a full explanation of the process while living through it. She simply kept walking faithfully through uncertainty, and that quiet perseverance became part of the very transformation God was creating within her. This is important because many people think faith means never struggling internally. But mature faith is not the absence of struggle. It is choosing trust, even while struggle still exists. That distinction changes how you view your own spiritual journey, because maybe you have judged yourself harshly for still feeling anxious sometimes. Maybe you assumed strong believers never wrestle with fear. Maybe you believed spiritual maturity meant never questioning, never struggling emotionally, never feeling weary. But Scripture repeatedly shows faithful people wrestling deeply inside. David wrestled, Elijah wrestled, Job wrestled, Naomi wrestled. Even Ruth walked through uncertainty without visible guarantees. The difference was not that they never struggled emotionally. The difference was that they continued turning toward God instead of completely away from Him. And perhaps that is more significant than you realize, because sometimes exhausted believers assume they are failing spiritually simply because they feel tired. But weariness itself is not failure. Struggle itself is not proof that your faith is weak. Sometimes struggle is simply evidence that you are human and still learning trust in deeper ways. That realization brings compassion into the process. Instead of condemning yourself for every anxious thought, you begin understanding that spiritual growth often unfolds gradually. Trust deepens layer by layer. Fear loosens slowly. Healing develops progressively. And during that process, God remains patient. That patience matters because many people secretly fear they are disappointing God through their emotional struggles. They think, if I trusted more, I would not feel this anxious. If my faith were stronger, I would not struggle this much. If God were truly pleased with me, life would probably feel easier. But Ruth's story completely challenges the idea that difficulty equals divine rejection. Ruth was faithful while life still felt uncertain. Naomi was grieving while God was still moving. The process remained uncomfortable while redemption quietly unfolded underneath the surface. That means your present struggle does not automatically disqualify you from God's purpose. In fact, some of the deepest transformation often happens inside uncomfortable seasons. Not because suffering itself is good, but because suffering exposes where trust still needs to grow. And growth often happens most deeply when control disappears. That is difficult because human nature constantly reaches for certainty. You want to secure outcomes? Predict the future. Protect yourself emotionally from disappointment. But eventually, every waiting season confronts you with the limits of your own control. No amount of overthinking can force peace into existence. No amount of fear can accelerate God's timing. No amount of anxiety can guarantee the future. At Sami point, the soul becomes exhausted from trying to carry what only God can truly hold securely. And strangely, that exhaustion can become the beginning of surrender. Not surrender rooted in hopelessness. Surrender rooted in trust. The kind of trust that slowly says, maybe I do not need every answer right now. Maybe God is still guiding me even here. Maybe silence is not abandonment after all. That shift changes the emotional atmosphere inside the heart. Fear loses some of its power. Urgency begins softening, and peace starts growing quietly beneath the surface. Not because circumstances instantly become perfect, but because your understanding of God begins changing. You stop seeing Him only through visible outcomes. You begin recognizing His faithfulness through His character. That is one of the deepest lessons hidden inside Ruth's story. God's faithfulness was present before the resolution arrived. And maybe that is true in your life right now too. Maybe God has been sustaining you more than you realized. Maybe the strength that carried you this far was already evidence of His presence. Maybe the reason you have not completely fallen apart is because grace has quietly held you together even during the hardest moments. Sometimes people overlook that. They focus so heavily on what still feels unresolved that they fail to recognize how much God has already carried them through. But look back honestly for a moment. There were days you thought would break you completely. Days where your mind felt overwhelmed. Days where your future looked frighteningly uncertain. And yet somehow, you are still here. Still breathing. Still seeking God. Still hoping, even if only quietly. That matters, because hopelessness would have completely closed your heart by now. The fact that you still long for peace, still search for truth, still desire God's presence, reveals that He has not abandoned you. He is still drawing you gently forward. And perhaps the greatest shift happens when you finally stop demanding immediate explanations and start trusting that God can still be good, even while parts of your story remain unfinished. That is where fear slowly loses control. Not because every question disappears, but because trust becomes stronger than the need to understand everything immediately. And once that shift begins, something beautiful starts happening internally. You no longer measure God's presence only by emotion. You begin recognizing Him through faithfulness, endurance, quiet, provision, and hidden grace. That realization leads directly into the final transformation hidden inside the story of Ruth and Boaz. What once looked like delay, loss, and silence was actually leading toward redemption all along. When you look at the story of Ruth and Boaz, from the ending, everything appears beautifully connected. The loss, the waiting, the ordinary days, the hidden timing, the quiet encounters, the delayed answers. All of it eventually reveals a greater purpose that Ruth could never fully see while living through the process itself. And maybe that is the hidden lesson your own heart needs most right now. Because while Ruth was grieving, she could not yet see redemption. While Naomi felt emptied by life, she could not yet see restoration. While the future looked uncertain, God was already weaving together details that would eventually reveal His faithfulness clearly. That means something important for your own life. Just because you cannot currently see the full picture does not mean God has stopped creating one. The human heart struggles with unfinished stories. You naturally want immediate resolution. You want life to make sense quickly. You want visible proof that your pain carries purpose. But God often reveals purpose gradually because trust deepens most when faith learns to survive uncertainty. That is exactly what happened in Ruth's journey. The fields did not look important at first. The waiting did not feel meaningful at first. The ordinary moments did not appear connected to anything extraordinary at first. Yet every hidden step was leading somewhere. And perhaps your own life contains hidden connections you do not recognize yet either. Maybe the season that felt like delay was actually preparation. Maybe the closed doors protected you from paths that would have harmed you. Maybe the weighing strengthened parts of your character that future blessings will require. Maybe God was developing endurance, wisdom, humility, and dependence quietly while you thought nothing was happening. That possibility changes how you carry your story. Instead of viewing your life only through what feels unfinished, you begin recognizing that unfinished does not mean abandoned. There is a difference. An unfinished story still holds future purpose. An abandoned story does not. And Ruth's story proves that God does not abandon what He is still unfolding. Even when the process feels painfully slow, that realization brings peace into places where fear once controlled your thinking. Because fear constantly tells you the current chapter defines the entire future. Fear interprets temporary pain as permanent reality. But God sees beyond the present chapter. He sees restoration while you still see uncertainty. He sees growth while you still feel weakness. He sees redemption while you still feel confusion. And slowly, your perspective begins changing too. Not because every answer suddenly appears, but because trust starts becoming stronger than fear. That transformation is deeply important because many people spend years trapped emotionally, waiting for complete certainty before allowing themselves to feel peace. But complete certainty about the future was never meant to be the foundation of your peace. God's character is, and once you begin anchoring yourself there, something inside you stabilizes. You stop needing immediate explanations for every delay. You stop interpreting silence as rejection automatically. You stop assuming unanswered questions mean God is absent. Instead, you begin understanding something Ruth's story quietly reveals from beginning to end. God works faithfully in hidden places, in ordinary days, in quiet processes, in unseen timing, in small acts of obedience, in moments that initially appear insignificant. That means your current season may hold more meaning than your emotions can presently recognize. Even now, God may be preparing relationships, opportunities, healing, wisdom, or direction beyond your current understanding. Even now, He may be strengthening you internally for responsibilities you are not ready to carry yet. Even now, grace may be sustaining you in ways you have overlooked because fear kept focusing only on what remained unresolved. And maybe for the first time in a long while, your heart can begin relaxing its grip on the need to control everything. Not because life suddenly feels easy, but because you are finally realizing you are never carrying your future alone. God has been present in every hidden chapter, present in the grief, present in the confusion, present in the waiting, present in the silence. Even when you could not fully recognize Him, that truth creates a different kind of strength inside you. Not loud confidence rooted in perfect circumstances, but quiet stability rooted in trust. The kind of trust that says, I may not understand everything yet, but I believe God is still guiding my life. I may not see the outcome clearly, but I trust that my waiting is not wasted. I may still carry questions, but I no longer believe silence means abandonment. That is where emotional healing begins deepening. Because peace is not born from controlling the future. Peace grows when your heart learns that God remains faithful, even in uncertainty. And perhaps that is why the story of Ruth continues touching people so deeply. Centuries later, it reflects real life, not polished perfection, not instant answers, not dramatic certainty from beginning to end, but ordinary people walking through grief, uncertainty, waiting, and hidden processes while God quietly guides redemption beneath the surface. That is why your current season still matters. Even if it feels slow, even if parts remain unresolved, even if your emotions still fluctuate sometimes, your story is not finished. And God often does His deepest work before people fully recognize what He is building. So if your heart feels tired today, remember this carefully. Loss does not mean God has left. Waiting does not mean your life has no direction. Silence does not mean heaven is empty. Sometimes God is doing His most meaningful work where human eyes cannot yet fully see. Just like Ruth gathering grain in an ordinary field. Just like Naomi grieving without realizing restoration was already beginning. Just like Boaz entering the story at exactly the right moment. Nothing was random. And maybe your life is not random either. Maybe the hidden season you are living through right now is still carrying purpose. Maybe God is already weaving together details your future self will one day understand more clearly. Maybe what feels delayed today will eventually reveal wisdom, protection, and timing you could not previously recognize. Until then, your invitation is simple. Keep walking faithfully. Keep trusting quietly. Keep bringing your fears honestly before God. Keep showing up one day at a time. Not because you already see the full picture, but because God does. And that changes everything. If this message spoke to your heart, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue growing together in faith and truth. And remember this tonight as you carry your unanswered questions into another day. God is still working in the hidden places of your life, even now.